Well, this week, Colorado's highest court with a landmark ruling that former President Trump's name cannot appear on a campaign ballot, saying that Trump's actions on January 6th, 2021, disqualifies him under a section of the 14th Amendment. Now, as we enter presidential election year, the ruling will likely be in the hands of the Supreme Court. For more on what's at stake, Yahoo Finance reporters Rick Newman and Alexis Keenan are here. Now, this is a pretty complex case. So, Alexis, I'm going to have you set the scene here in terms of how this ruling out of Colorado is different from some of these other cases that we're seeing.
Yeah, so let's try to make it as easy as possible here. This is all about the 14th Amendment and one of its sections, and let's try to break it down. So what this Colorado Supreme Court said is that states cannot, under the 14th Amendment, this is in the Constitution, cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So life, liberty, and property, you can argue Trump and his right to run as a candidate for President of the United States, and due process of law. That's a trial with evidence, with all cards on the table showing what is and what isn't in a body of court. Section 3, though, part of the 14th Amendment, that says that a person cannot hold office, public office, if they engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States. Now, this 4-3 decision that the Colorado Supreme Court came to, they recognize that this is uncharted territory, that these are legal questions of first impression, but ultimately saying that this Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does apply to Trump and disqualifies him from the state's primary ballot because, they say, at trial in the district court here, they say evidence showed that Trump did engage in insurrection. Now, one could debate that fact and say, well, Trump has not been convicted of any crime of insurrection, but the court also paused the ruling here, saying that they would wait until January 4th. That's a day before the Secretary of State in Colorado has to certify who is going to be on that primary ballot. But they said that that date would then extend out if, that's a big if, this case is taken up by the Supreme Court. So that is what we are waiting to learn at this juncture.
Rick, of course, we're talking about this because the former president is the overwhelming favorite within the Republican Party. When you look at the presidential election next year, this is just Colorado, but we're just several weeks out from the Iowa caucus. How do you think this shakes things up politically?
My guess is that this will actually make Trump a little more popular within the Republican Party because every time there's some new criminal charge against him, you know, he comes out and he says, look, they're persecuting me. I'm a victim of the deep state. And that actually works with some Republican voters. So, I mean, we have more wild cards in the 2024 election than in any other election in memory. And I think a lot of people have been so focused on Trump's criminal cases, 4 criminal cases involving 91 charges, that's where all the attention has been. And then the Colorado Supreme Court kind of surprises everybody with this ruling. So I think the most likely outcome at this point is that the Supreme Court does take the case and that they overrule Colorado and Trump is allowed to stay on the ballot and this goes away. But that is far from certain. And there could be an outcome here that sort of lets this Colorado Supreme Court finding stand and then raises the question of whether other states can do the same thing and pull him off the ballot, which could interfere with Trump's ability to lock up the Republican primary election. And then if this happens in swing states where Trump would need to win to actually win in November 24, it could impair his ability in the general election. So if it remains an open case, it's a real can of worms, which is one reason why the Supreme Court might rule decisively on this. But boy, interesting. And we're not going to know for a little while at least.
Alexis, let's pick up on that point. What is the likelihood that the U.S. Supreme Court says, yeah, we'll hear the case and wades right into what was sure to be a political discussion?
Yeah, so now if someone petitions, and we're expecting there will be a petition from one or both or several parties to this case, if they do, they're going to have to make a quick decision at that with this January deadline looming. But Akiko, there are some different rulings, including from the district court in Colorado. So the Supreme Court in Colorado came to a different conclusion in part than this court did. It has a different effect. And that's because the Colorado District Court, they said that this Section 3 does not apply to the president of the United States. So that's the question that the court would be taking up. Not to mention, there are cases that have gone to the high court in Minnesota. There are also cases on this issue in Michigan, Missouri. And in Minnesota, the Supreme Court there held that a primary election is more akin to an internal party election. And therefore, because it doesn't automatically place the candidate on the general election ballot, that they didn't even get into or wade into this 14th Amendment and Section 3 argument. So there are a lot of different legal avenues that the Supreme Court would be contending with here. And it's anybody's guess what they would decide about this now controversial issue.
And Rick, we know that markets tend to see a lot of volatility already in an election year. What does this mean, you think, going forward then with this new wrinkle? As we mentioned, that deadline coming up towards January 5th, and still a lot of uncertainty then going into upcoming primaries.
I think it's hard for investors to bet on the outcome of the presidential election 11 months ahead of time. And I think it's hard to bet on the outcome even before you know who the candidates will officially be, which happens over the summer, 3 months or so before the election. However, when we get to next fall, this is going to be front and center for markets. Markets really do care who wins a presidential election. And one famous example of this is when Trump had the surprise win in 2016 on election night in November of 2016, when the famous, the notorious, I guess I could say, New York Times needle started to flip away from Hillary Clinton over to Donald Trump. The S&P futures shot up because if Trump were to get elected, that means possible tax cuts, possible deregulation, and things that would basically boost corporations' bottom lines, which actually happened. And even before Election Day, there were things that moved the markets a little bit one way or the other based on whether one candidate looked like he or she was inching ahead and so on. So this is going to be a big deal for markets come, let's say, September and October of next year. For now, it just needs to play out, and everybody's obviously waiting to find out who are the candidates going to be in the first place and who's likely to have the edge.
And we are, as we said, just weeks away from primary season kicking off there. Rick Newman and Alexis Keenan, as always, thanks so much for breaking that down for us today.
Bye, guys.